Hello and welcome to Azure Stack HCI Tech Talk. Good morning. My name is Sven Langenfeld. I'm the Azure Stack HCI Commercial Sales Specialist, and I'm happy and proud to spend some time with you this morning talking about Azure Stack HCI licensing. So whenever you have some questions, please don't hesitate and type them in the chat window. And at the end of the session, we can go through this question together. So today we will cover 4 topics. We will talk about Azure Stack HCI licensing through the pay-as-you-go model. I will explain the Azure Hybrid Benefits and show how to activate them. And I will talk about Azure Virtual Desktop on premises on Azure Stack HCI and how to license. And then we will talk about hosted environments. So how can you use Azure Stack HCI environment, Azure Stack HCI in a hosted environment? Okay, but before we start, I would like to introduce my new website. So this new website is for everyone who cares about Azure Stack HCI. The intent of this website is to bring together all the information I'm aware of worldwide from multiple sources that are pre-selected by myself. So if you are interested in Azure Stack HCI and you wonder where to get the bits and bytes for a demo environment, who can support you, what Azure Stack HCI is, where you can find decks, white papers, case studies, technical learning resources, sales resources, information about hardware vendors who are important for Azure Stack HCI because you need certified hardware and so on. Everything is on this website. The URL is svenlangenfeld-techtalk.com, and this video is included in this website as well. And if you're interested in the slides, you can download them in the licensing section of the svenlangenfeld-techtalk.com website. Okay, so let's start. Before we start talking about licensing in detail, let's talk about the platform Azure Stack HCI. So it's important to understand what Azure Stack HCI is. Azure Stack HCI is an operating system for the host. So with Azure Stack HCI, you got 3 components. You got compute, storage, and networking, a hyper-converged infrastructure. Plus, you got a lot of Azure services. So if you use Azure Stack HCI, you have Hyper-V contained. So you can use it, no additional cost. It's part of the Azure Stack HCI operating system. You can use storage spaces direct for managing your storage. And you can, of course, use software-defined network. And everything is combined in one license. There are no hidden costs. It's one price, and we will talk about that in a minute. On the right side, you can see Azure Arc. Azure Arc is the link between Azure and your on-premises infrastructure. And Azure Arc integrates your Azure Stack HCI infrastructure into the Azure portal. And Azure Arc is for free as well, so there are no hidden costs. If you're using Azure services provided through Azure Arc, to your Azure Stack HCI environment, then of course there may be some cost. If this is costly on Azure, it costs you something on Azure Stack HCI as well. But the infrastructure, Azure Arc, is without additional cost. On top of Azure Stack HCI, you can use VMs, so Windows VMs, Linux VMs. And the licensing of Windows Server in the guest operating system works exactly the same way as on any other on-premises infrastructure. So there's no difference. You have to pay for that. Additionally to the Azure Stack HCI host operating system, where you get all the benefits from. And you can use Azure Kubernetes services on top of Azure Stack HCI. There will be some cost for Azure Kubernetes services. We will talk about that a little bit later. And then on top, you can use Azure Arc-enabled data services, containers, and so on. So let's talk about the licensing of the Azure Stack HCI operating system. The cost for the operating system is $10 per month per active physical processor core. It's important to understand that it's the active physical core you have to pay for. So Azure Stack HCI is a very flexible solution. So compared to a normal Windows server on premises where you have to license all physical cores, no matter if you use them or not, Azure Stack HCI only bills you for the active physical cores. So the more you use, the more you pay. And most of our OEMs are offering software solutions to activate and deactivate physical cores. And if they don't have their own solution, it's possible through some workarounds. So active physical cores you have to pay for. And there are no hidden costs. You do not pay for storage amount. You do not pay for data traffic or anything like that. Only the $10 per physical month per core. Azure Stack HCI is an Azure service. So you need an Azure subscription. And if you have some conditions on Azure Stack HCI, maybe some rebates for Azure services all up, these rebates apply for Azure Stack HCI as well, because it's an Azure services. Azure Stack HCI is part of your Azure bill at the end of the month. And you can pay for that subscription through enterprise agreements, for example, or through CSP, or through Microsoft Direct. So you can insert your credit card into the Azure portal and say, please pay through Azure, the Azure consumption through my credit card. All these things are possible. So it's an Azure service, and you pay like you pay other Azure services as well. The guest operating system is not included in the cost of $10 per physical month per core. So you have to pay additionally for the guest operating system. But this is the same as on other HCI platforms in the market. And then you have a 60 days trial for free. So that's very good. If you want to try Azure Stack HCI, you get access to a demo environment. And for 60 days, you can try without any cost. So in a nutshell, that's the pay-as-you-go licensing for Azure Stack HCI. The more you use, the more you pay. If you do not want to use it any longer, you can unsubscribe, and then your cost ends immediately. But there's an alternative solution to license Azure Stack HCI, and this is the Azure Hybrid Benefit. And I will show you what it is and how to activate. Azure Hybrid Benefits is not new, but the inclusion of Azure Stack HCI into the Azure Hybrid Benefits, this is new. So we have it since October 1.5 years ago. And there are three components that are super important and I would like to explain to you. So one is a benefit you have for containers, the other for cloud usage, and one for the on-premises part. These are all additional benefits. So you do not have to choose the on-premises or the cloud or the containers. You can use all these benefits combined. And to get access to the Azure Hybrid Benefits, you need a Windows Server Data Center license for every single physical core on your Azure Stack HCI node or cluster, plus an active software assurance for the same amount of physical cores. Or you have a subscription license for Windows Server Data Center, the same for every physical core of your node or your cluster. The Azure Hybrid Benefits can be activated only for the whole cluster, not for a single node in between, in a cluster. Okay, so the whole cluster has to be activated through the pay-as-you-go model or the Azure Hybrid Benefit model. There's no mix possible in a cluster. Okay, let's dig a little bit deeper into the three models and let's start with the containers. So what is the benefit of Azure Hybrid Benefit for container usage? The benefit is very simple. You get Azure Kubernetes services for free on premises, on Windows Server or Azure Stack HCI. So for example, the cost of Azure Kubernetes services on Azure Stack HCI is $80 per virtual core per day. And if you have Windows Server Data Center plus software assurance or a Windows Server Data Center subscription, and you activate the Azure Hybrid Benefits, then you get Azure Kubernetes for free. So depending on how many virtual cores you use, you can do your math by yourself and try to find out how much cost you save through the Azure Hybrid Benefits. Another benefit is for the cloud. So this is really a cool solution for everyone who's using Azure and Azure Stack HCI, because Azure Stack HCI is a hybrid solution. It's natively integrated into Azure. And of course, it's an on-premises solution. There's no data going to Azure if you want to keep your data on Azure Stack HCI, but it's a kind of extension of Azure to your on-premises. And if you want to use Azure Stack HCI and Azure Hybrid Benefits deliver an additional benefit for you. That's why it's called Azure Hybrid Benefits. So the benefit is the following. If you have Windows Server Data Center plus software assurance for, let's say, 72 cores, you can use these 72 cores Windows Server in Azure as well. So additionally to the usage on premises. So if you go to the price calculator in Azure, for example, and you try to find out what is the cost of a virtual machine in Azure. And here's an example, an 8-core solution. An 8-core solution with licensing included. Licensing included means you pay for the compute and the storage and everything, plus for the Windows Server license in this guest operating system. If you switch or if you click the Azure Hybrid Benefit, then the cost for the guest operating system will not apply, so you get it for free. And in this example, you can see that the compute cost for the chosen virtual machine is round about $400. These $400 are per month if you run the virtual machine the complete month. The cost for the guest operating system Windows Server is round about $200. So all up you pay $600. So you save $200 for 8 cores per month for the guest operating system. So this is $400 for 16 cores. And a 16-core software assurance for around about 3 years cost $4,000 to $5,000, I think, roundabout. So you save for 16 cores $400 per month. So this is $4,800 per year. So the cost of the software assurance is covered after 1 year, but the cost is for 3 years. So you save a lot of money using the Azure Hybrid Benefit in a hybrid environment. And now the third thing is that you can use the Azure Hybrid Benefits for Azure Stack HCI specifically. And what does this mean? Maybe you have seen these slides in other presentations, and someone told you that you can use your Windows Server Data Center on premises for licensing the guest operating system, or you can exchange the cores for the usage of Azure Stack HCI. So you have to decide if you want to run virtual machines with Windows Server or have Azure Stack HCI for free. But in reality, it's not an or, it's an and. You have both. So from the licensing perspective, an or is okay, because if you use the Azure Hybrid Benefits and decide to use Azure Stack HCI without additional cost, you are losing the right to use your data center license on premises. But you get data center for your guest operating system without additional cost on a separate way. So you get it. And that's why I say it's an and. And I will explain how this works. So if you connected your Azure Stack HCI cluster to Azure Portal, and you connect through the Azure Portal to your Azure Stack HCI cluster, and you go to the configuration. Then you can see, and this is not very big, but I can try to make it a little bit bigger. But it's not so important to read it. I would like to explain how it works. So you go on your Azure Stack HCI portal, you connect with your Azure Stack HCI cluster, you go to configuration, and you can see the segment Azure Hybrid Benefit. And under Azure Hybrid Benefit, there's an option to activate it. If you press activate on the right side here, you can see how many physical cores you have. And this window explains to you that this cost will switch from whatever dollar, $10 per physical core per month, to 0. If you want to activate it, press the button. If you do this, from this moment on, Azure Stack HCI for your cluster is for free. But now you are losing the right of your Windows Server data center license to use Windows servers in your guest operating system. But as I explained before, there's a workaround to get back the license rights for Windows Server data center in the guest. And this is exactly on the same screen as the activation of Azure Hybrid Benefits. Because when you activated the Azure Hybrid Benefits, you have a green icon, and below you can see the Windows Server Subscription add-on. This Windows Server Subscription add-on is an alternative to license your guest operating system on Azure Stack HCI. It's a pay-as-you-go license. If you want to use it, switch it on. If you don't want to use it, switch it off. The cost is $23 something per physical core per month. So it's not the cheapest way to license Windows Server in the guest operating system. But it has some benefits. It's pay as you go, and you do not need Windows Server CALs for that. So you save the cost for Windows Server CALs on premises as long as you only use this Windows Server subscription and no other Windows Server, of course, because then you would need Windows Server CALs for the other Windows servers that are not covered by the Windows Server subscription add-on. So this Windows Server Subscription add-on button usually generates the cost of $23 roundabout per physical course per month. But at the moment when you activated the Azure Hybrid Benefit, then you can see that this Windows Server Subscription add-on is for free. So you do not get invoiced for that. And if you activate this, then you have Azure Stack HCI without additional cost, and you have the Windows Server guest operating system without additional cost. From licensing perspective, it's super important that you activate this button, because if you only activate the Azure Hybrid Benefit, then you are losing the right of the usage of your Windows Server data center on-premises license. But at the moment when you activate the Windows Server subscription add-on, you get back the rights to use Windows Server Unlimited in your Azure Stack HCI environment. Okay, so that's it. Now let's talk about Azure Virtual Desktop on-premises. So Azure Virtual Desktop is the only solution for Windows Server in a multi-session environment. And in the past, it was only available on Azure. I guess that's why it's called Azure Virtual Desktop. But since February this year, it's available on Azure Stack HCI as well. So this is one of the hybrid benefits we have, that Azure Stack HCI is an extension of Azure and brings services you only can use on Azure to your on-premises infrastructure. So for example, with Azure Stack HCI, you get extended security updates for unsupported operating systems like you have them on Azure, or the Azure Update Manager. It's a solution for free on Azure, costs $5 per server per month on premises, but on Azure Stack HCI, it's for free as well, because it's an extension of Azure, and some of the Azure benefits are coming to Azure Stack HCI to your on-premises infrastructure. And Azure Stack HCI is a solution that you can run on premises as well. So you can deploy your Azure Virtual Desktop through the Azure portal, and you can decide by deploying if you want to run your Azure Virtual Desktop host, for example, on Azure or on Azure Stack HCI. And if you use it on Azure Stack HCI, there are some costs coming to you. So for one component of the cost for Azure Virtual Desktop is, of course, the operating system Azure Virtual Desktop. The operating system Azure Stack HCI. This is what we talked about earlier. On top of Azure Stack HCI, you have to pay for Azure Virtual Desktop. And there are two components you have to have in mind. So one is the access. Accessing Azure Virtual Desktop is something you have to pay for. And if you are running Windows 11 or Windows 10 Enterprise in the multi-session or the normal version, or you're running Windows Server, there are two different options to license the user access rights. So for Windows, you have to have Windows 365, E3, E5, A3, A6, F3, and so on. You can read it on the screen. Business Premium is included as well. Or you can have a Windows Enterprise or Education license. And you have the opportunity to license per virtual desktop access. On Azure, you can also use the per user access, the external user per access licensing. This is not possible on Azure Stack HCI, but on Azure. And if you are running Windows Server in the Azure Virtual Desktop environment, then you have to license the accessing individual with remote desktop services, CALs, and software assurance. And then there's a second component of cost that applies to Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI, and this is the usage cost. And this is $1 per virtual core per hour. This is exactly the cost we all waited for around about 2 years, and now it's official, $1 per virtual core per hour. And of course, only active hours. So when you shut down your environment, you do not use it, you do not have to pay for it. Yeah, that's the licensing of Azure Virtual Desktop. And finally, let's talk about hosted environments, and then we will have a look at your questions. So hosted environment, how can we use Azure Stack HCI in a hosted environment? So on the left side, you can see the customer side. On the right side, the hoster side. There are several options how a hoster can provide its services. So for example, if the customer wants to have the Azure Stack HCI node or cluster on his own site, no problem. The cluster can be owned by the customer or by the hoster. Doesn't make a difference, as long as the hoster is managing this solution. The Azure subscription for Azure Stack HCI has to be owned by the customer. That's important. It cannot be provided by the hoster. It has to be a subscription on the name of the customer. Of course, the hoster can offer Azure subscription through CSP to the customer, but the customer has to be owner of the Azure subscription. The guest operating system, for example, Windows servers or applications like Exchange, SharePoint, and so on, can be licensed by the customer. So, for example, through the OEM licensing, open licensing, Azure Enterprise Agreement, you name them, or SPLA licensing, so Service Provider License Agreement. As long as it's a hosted environment at the customer side, SPLA is fine as well. If the customer decides not to run Azure Stack HCI in its own site, but on the customer side, that's possible as well. That's a smaller picture in the middle. So the same configuration, but the dedicated cluster is at the hoster side. So you have Azure Stack HCI cluster only for this individual customer. The Azure subscription is owned by the customer. Guest operating and apps can be licensed by the customer through bring your own license. This is something we have for some months, or the SPLA licensing. On the right side, you see the scenario where most of our hosters are interested in. Is it possible to run Azure Stack HCI on my infrastructure that is shared to multiple customers? And there is a no, it's not, and yes, it is alternative depending on the details. So if the hoster is running Azure Stack HCI on his own data center, and they want to offer something that the customer can have exactly the same, for example, on Azure, then it's not allowed. That the Azure subscription is a subscription from the hoster on the hoster's name. So the hoster is not allowed to run Azure Stack HCI on his own data center to land VMs or any other services that are available on Azure as well. But if the hoster is an ISV offering a specific solution, so for example, for bookkeeping or a medical solution, and they have a lot of customers, and they are using Azure Stack HCI as the infrastructure to run their individual software service, and they give access to their bookkeeping or medical customers, and the customer has access to this virtualized software, it does not make a difference if this software is running on an Azure Stack HCI or any other platform. Then it's okay that the Azure subscription is owned by the hoster. This is the only scenario where this is okay. Cool. So now we are at the end. I want to recommend again my new website, svenlangenfeld-techtalk.com. You can find the presentation slides on this website in the segment licensing. You can find a lot of videos from a lot of resources all across the world, documents, case studies, information, resources. So if you want to, please visit this website and stay up to date. All the news about Azure Stack HCI I get aware of will be on that website again. And now let's spend some time in answering your question. So one question is, unfortunately, I cannot attend the entire presentation. Will they publish the video later? Yeah. So there are a lot of options. So at the moment, you are watching through LinkedIn. On LinkedIn, you can watch the video on demand, so no problem. Or you go to my my YouTube channel, the Azure Stack HCI Tech Talk on YouTube. There you can watch the video on demand as well. And on my new website, svenlangenfeld-techtalk.com. This video is embedded in the licensing segment, and you can download the slides as well. So one more question. Can I use Windows Server subscriptions offered by CSP for Azure Hybrid Benefit? Yes, so Windows Server Data Center subscription can be offered by CSP. And that's absolutely eligible. Yeah. Okay, there are no more questions. If you have some more questions, you can always reach out to me individually. So please follow me on LinkedIn, for example, Sven Langenfeld. You will find me on LinkedIn, or go to Azure Stack HCI Tech Talk on LinkedIn. There you can raise your questions as well. But for questions, it's easier to connect with me on my private Sven Langenfeld LinkedIn channel. And yeah, looking forward to see you again in other calls. For today, there are no more questions, so I would like to say goodbye and thank you.